and here it changes here as well. What?
Okay, alguna presentación. Como es la primera vez que vienen a IEMed, también los estudiantes pueden hacer una presentación. Okay, let's start the lecture. And properly speaking, before presenting Professor Awad, I would like to welcome you to IEMed because I know that it is the first time for most of you that you are in this institution working on basically focusing on migration and Mediterranean. And I think you have many documentation outside about what they produce on Mediterranean affairs, international law, and so on. And I think it's a great opportunity also for you to go abroad and then to abandon university and to go to some lecture abroad and to have contact also with other students because these IEMed organized this seminar related to Mediterranean with other master program in Barcelona, and it is very good opportunity also for you to meet people from other university. And I guess that most of the people, young people that I see are not from my master students, but are from other master students and master program, and then I guess it's also a good opportunity to link with them. If you have any question concerning IEMed or and so on, it's also welcome. But I invite you also to go to the website. And I also thanks IEMed representative here to welcome us also. Okay, today we begin also some lecture related to Mediterranean. That is, as you know, one of the main focus also of the master program, and we are very pleased to begin this lecture with Professor Awad, that will speak basically about the link between instability and political instability and migration. A link that sometimes we think about that, but it's maybe difficult to articulate through research and also to articulate properly. And I think we have a good opportunity to listen to him about that. Professor Awad comes from American University of El Cairo in Egypt. He's Professor of Global Affairs and Director of Center of Migration and Refugee Studies, School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in American University of El Cairo. And he has been working also, not only university, but very linked also to the League of Arab States, United Nations, and International Labour Organization, holding position as Secretary of the Commission and also in the Sub-Regional Office of North African and Director also on the International Migration Program. His research interests encompass international governance, refugees, a Euro-Mediterranean relation, international organization, and also political transition in the Middle East and global governance and sustainable development agenda. I think the link between international affairs in general, North Africa in particular, and also migration will be also a good opportunity for you to open also globally most of the information that you have on migration, in particular in Europe and so on. Nothing more to say. Also that maybe you know, most of you know that we are in GREE team, the research group that is linked with the Master Migration Studies, has just opened a network on European and Mediterranean migration research, a network of research centers in the Mediterranean. The opportunity was last year IMISCO annual conference that we organized, and Professor Awad and myself are coordinating and trying to coordinate 18 institutes in the Mediterranean working on migration, working on Mediterranean, and trying to link together North, South, East, and West, and Mediterranean. IEMed also is in some way involved also in this kind of initiative. And most of the lecture that you will have this year in IEMed related to migration and Mediterranean will be done by professors that are linked to research center of this network. And Professor Awad will be the first one, and maybe the most prominent one, because we are trying to construct together this kind of Euro-Mediterranean migration building. We will know if we manage to do so for the next year, but in any case, this also belongs to this initiative. And we are very pleased to welcome him. I am sure we will learn a lot, and don't hesitate, please, to ask questions, whatever question, and to take the opportunity of this great opportunity to have Professor Awad and the effort that he has had to come from El Cairo to Barcelona for us. I thank you very much to be there. And sorry for the weather, because the weather is not so much, but we don't understand why in April we are not sunshine. But in any case, I hope you will have also the opportunity to visit and to revisit Barcelona and to enjoy also our town. Thank you very much to be there, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Zapata. It's a real pleasure to be back in the European Institute of the Mediterranean, and I'd like to thank you for your very kind invitation to me to come to talk to your students of University Pompeu Fabra. It's an opportunity that I value, and I value seeing you again and seeing some old friends here. Of course, you're not responsible for the weather. Barcelona always has much better weather than today, but this is one reason to return soon, to enjoy its weather and its beautiful buildings and surroundings. I have been asked to talk about migration in the Mediterranean. So I thought about what I could select as an issue, what problematic I could select to talk about. And finally, I came up with the idea of evaluating how migration has taken place in the past and how migration may take place in the future in normal conditions of stability, and in unnatural conditions, which are conditions of instability, such as those that we have witnessed in recent years in the Euro-Mediterranean area. My argument, which I will try to bring some evidence to, is that migration in the past has had or has not been exceptional in any way in the region. It has responded to the same factors that generate international migration everywhere, according to the theories of international migration, and you are certainly all familiar with these theories, that in the future also it will continue responding to the factors identified in theories of international migration, and that the real issue really is when instability sets itself in the region. Instability is behind some unexpected population movements, and we'll see from the past what has happened when instability was experienced in the region. And from this past, we would like to infer some future possible courses of population movements. This is, in a few words, what I will try to do. You know, as an analytical framework, if we take the different theories of international migration, we know that no one theory of international migration can really account for movements. All theories have some aspects which are valid in some situations and others which are not valid. And by definition, a theory cannot explain each and every situation. Because if a theory explains each and every situation, it loses all significance. A theory is generalizable. It generalizes the situation. And therefore, because we find in different theories, whether neoclassical theory of international migration, whether the new economics of liberal migration theory, whether structural theories, whether historical theories, all of them have some aspects which are valid in explaining international migration. If we look at them together, we can come up with an analytical framework that helps us understand what has happened in the region and what may happen in the future in the region. So in conditions of stability, political factors lose their importance. They are neutralized. And in these conditions, we will have factors, economic and liberal market factors at origin and destination, which will generate international migration or stop international migration. And we'll have other historical structural factors that explain the movement of international migration. It is in conditions of instability that you'll have political factors determining migration and determining migration that will take up several manifestations and several shapes. So in countries, in conditions of stability, we will have factors at origin and factors at destination. Very often we find that there is an overemphasis on factors at origin, as if migration happened only because some people want to change airs or take the air in some other country. So, but it is also true that some factors exist in these countries. Essentially, labor market outcomes, unemployment, underemployment, informal employment which is related to countries of origin, whether this happens in the south of the Mediterranean or whether it happens in Latin America and Central America or in Asia, you will find that informal employment and underemployment are related to questions of low wages, absence of social protection, absence of career advancement, and all other terms and conditions of work. Because it is now evident that migration does not only result from absence of jobs or absence of employment. Most migrants, in fact, are not very poor and do not lack jobs. Most of them have their own job, but in which conditions? Sometimes they are in very precarious conditions that push them to migrate. So it is very important to look at the conditions in terms of employment of workers in developing countries that push them to migrate. Again, whether this happens in the Americas, in Africa, or in Asia, or in Central Asia, even in some countries of Europe, such as in Eastern Europe. In countries of destination, you also have questions of demand for labor in absolute terms and in certain sectors and occupations. In Europe, there is a question if in countries of origin you have high population growth and high rates of fertility, you have low rates of fertility in Europe, you have a shortage of labor supply, whether in absolute terms or in relative, because you may have oversupply in some sectors, in some occupations, and you may have shortage of supply in other sectors and occupations. And this demand may be formally expressed, officially expressed, and may be informal. Maybe informal in large informal economies, and we have countries with large informal economies in Southern Europe. And there you will have demand for labor, but it's not officially recognized. It is not officially recognized, and the supply is also not officially expressed, and this is at the origin of irregular migration and informal employment. And then, of course, you have other structural factors. You have the colonial and cultural links between countries of origin and destination. Colonial language issues, cultural proximity, the projection of an image of an advanced society, projection in developing countries, which also plays to attracting migrants. You have geographical proximity. You have the, nowadays, under globalization, you have the technological progress in communication, in transportation. Of course, you have the income inequality that some explain by historical processes of development and underdevelopment. All of these also contribute to population movements. So in reality, this is not a different situation that you may find in Central America, or that you may find between Indonesia and Malaysia, for instance. So the real question that we have is about population movements in conditions of instability. And here you have the political factors, which are the conditions of instability, as we have witnessed them in the last decades, not only about the current decade, but in the last decades. You have uprisings, you have revolutions, you have civil strifes, you have terrorism, and you have deteriorating conditions between countries of origin and destinations. The losers in cases of political instability and turmoil, losers are assumed to seek protection in other countries, usually first in neighboring and in bordering countries. But also because of instability, economic slowdown happens, which push other people to migrate to other lands. These are not properly refugees, because they are not, according to the 1951 Convention, they are not personally persecuted, but they seek livelihoods. So, in fact, political instability will generate two types of migration: refugees, but it will also generate labor migration. And a third type of migration will be return migration. And as we will see, this is what really happened in the region in the past decades. Deteriorating conditions between countries of origin and destination, and this has happened in many regions of the world, not only in the Mediterranean. Between Ghana and Nigeria, it has happened. So you will find deteriorating conditions or conditions of breakdown of peace that result in return migration. Conditions of conflict, of military hostilities that also generate return migration. So the political conditions, the condition of instability generate migration of general types. Other political attitudes, of course, are those of anti-immigrant discourse, xenophobia. These may result, these assumptions, in reduced migration, in return migration. And you may even envision situations where you have deportation of migrants, and we have seen this in the region in the early 1990s. I will try to go faster than that because otherwise Professor Zapata will call me to order. Now, all of these factors have generated migration. I'm taking 3 countries of North Africa: Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. And these are the figures around this current decade. You have the published figures, at least, like 4.5 million from Egypt, 5 million from Morocco. Tunisia, which is a much smaller population, you have like 1.2 million in 2014. But very importantly, for Mediterranean purposes, I should say immediately that Egyptian migration does not inscribe itself essentially in the Mediterranean circuit. Egyptian migration is essentially towards Arab countries in the Gulf, towards Jordan, towards Libya previously, but only secondarily and very far secondarily in European countries of the Mediterranean and beyond. And the evidence of this is this chart. Whereas in Morocco, some 90%, whereas in Egypt, some 90% are either in Arab countries in the Gulf, Jordan, Lebanon, and in the New World, in the US, Canada, and Australia. Only 10%, for some it's even lower than 10%, are in the European Union. To the contrary, in the case of Morocco, some 90% are in the European Union. And in the case of Tunisia, some 80% are in the European Union, less than Morocco, because one of the most important labor markets for Tunisia until that year was, of course, Libya, next door, Libya. But most importantly for the future, let's look at the evolution and the potential for migration from these 3 countries. Data, unfortunately, are not very abundant about migration in the region. But if we use what we have at hand, you will see that in reality, the annual average of migrants in the case of Egypt is being reduced. It's not being incremented. It is being reduced compared to what it was at the beginning of the decade. Despite the political and economic crisis through which Egypt has gone. In Morocco, in reality, Morocco, which is one of the largest countries of immigration to Europe in the region, you'll have very high intention to migrate, but quite lower, strong migratory potential. Contrary, and we'll see this confirmed by another figure in a minute or two. And in Tunisia, you'll have Tunisia, which was a scene of the first Arab uprising, or probably the only real revolution that has happened in the region. You'll have the net outflow of migrants from Tunisia for the last decade, between 2004 and 2014, was 14,000. All in all, including those who have migrated to Libya. So, in reality, we should draw conclusions from this and contrast the general discourse about pressures of migration from the southern shore of the Mediterranean on the northern shore. But of course, if you want to take the analysis, labor market analysis into account, you find that figures, one figure at least from Egypt, may be worrying, because of course you have like 700,000. In fact, I could even say higher than 700,000 entering the labor market every year in Egypt. And persistently in Egypt you have had lower job creation rate than labor force growth rate. So it means that you have higher and higher deficits in employment, whether it is expressed in outright unemployment or in underemployment, with deficient terms and conditions, and informal employment, which push workers to migrate. But again, Egyptians only secondarily migrate to European Union. They go rather to Jordan or to Gulf countries. But when it comes to Morocco and Tunisia, you have a very low labor force growth. It is 1.1% in both countries. 1.1% is a low rate of growth of labor. Not only is this particular rate low, but also the fertility rate is extremely low, which means that the population growth in the future will be low, and also the labor force growth. In Tunisia, it's already below. In Morocco, it is still higher, but it will soon, before 2030, the fertility rate will be lower than replacement, which also gives an idea about the evolution of population growth and labor force growth. This is the population and labor force situation, labor force image or picture that we have to take into account when thinking about the future and when thinking about what may happen in the future and the policies that may be needed in the future. Now, in situations of instability, we should look closely at what happened in the past and what may happen in the future. In 2011, the South Mediterranean experienced two important uprisings, two important revolutions, revolts, as you wish to call them. And there were preparations to face up to the huge flows of migration that would result from these uprisings. Nothing of that happened. Nothing of that happened except 25,000 migrants out of Tunisia in the spring 2011, one-off flow of migrants. In fact, you did not have migrants coming out of these countries, whether to Arab countries in the case of Egypt or to Europe in the case of Tunisia. In reality, it is political instability in countries of destination of migrants that created migration flows. When in Libya the turmoil broke out after the fall of the previous regime and after civil war, so that you had migration movements. And you had migration movements not towards Europe, but in fact towards countries of the region. You had return migration towards Egypt. You had return migration towards Tunisia. Not only return migration by Egyptians and Libyans, but you also had return migration by third country nationals. Nationals of Bangladesh, of the Philippines, of other regions in Africa, went east and west, and from there were flown out to their countries. In reality, so you will notice that when there is turmoil in countries of destination, migration movements take place. And this, in fact, I will not follow very closely the slides because of time also. This has antecedents. It was not the first time. In the early 1990s, Iraq invaded Kuwait. So you had immediately over 350,000 migrants from Kuwait and Iraq returning to Egypt. And you had over 700,000 migrants from Yemen deported out of Saudi Arabia back to Yemen. And then over the next decade, as sanctions were imposed on Iraq, you had millions of Egyptians returning from Iraq. Iraq had been in the 1980s because of the Iran-Iraq war. Iraq had brought in Egyptian migrants who work in the fields, and in fact, to make up to the absence of Iraqi workers on the war front, there were millions of Egyptians. They all returned to Egypt. It is a destination that this generated refugee flows. I think this is quite important. And when you jump and you return to the decade where we are, it's important to emphasize that it is return migration that has resulted from turmoil in countries of destination, receiving migrants from the large immigration countries in the region. It is not that the turmoil has generated migrants. The turmoil has not generated migrants. It is the turmoil in countries of destination of the migrants that generated return migration to their own countries. If you look at figures of migrants leaving Libya after the breakdown of law and order in Libya, you will find, I think, 3% only that reached Europe. Most of them, most of those who left Libya left east and west. So if you look at internal political factors in countries of origin, you will not really find factors generating migration. Now, you have also what I identified in the analytical framework, that xenophobia, that anti-immigrant discourse may be at the origin of return migration. In fact, this has not happened. So far, at least, this has not happened. With all the anti-immigrant discourse from some political trends in European countries, this has not resulted in large return to either to Tunisia or to Morocco, which are the main origin of migrants to Europe. I've already dealt with this. Why is that so? Why is that so? I think that we may focus on the policies that have been put in place. Very often, European policies have been faulted But in reality, the EU policies on migration in the region have been quite successful. They have prevented the movement of migration, whether the patrolling of the Mediterranean, whether the adoption by the Security Council of a resolution in 2016 that allows the militarization of fight against smuggling. It has been very, very successful. So there is really no room for the alarm about migration and refugee movement. What you will have, in fact, what you still has is the very normal migration movements, because the factors that really generate migration are still there. And you still have the high migration rates of the educated to highly educated from Morocco, from Tunisia in particular. You have the highly skilled migration, the manifestations of brain drain. And when I say that the policies have been successful, I'm not talking only about the policies of the European Union, I'm talking also about policies of other countries of destination, such as those receiving migrants from Egypt, like the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. As I said, migration, highly skilled migration continues. The real origin of migration movements have not changed. When we look at factors at destination, the employment question in Europe has not resulted in large, not only did the political factors not generate large return, but even the economic factors, even the economic and labor market situation has not resulted in large return. Again, because labor market situation, unemployment is not fungible. The unemployed in some occupations cannot fill out occupations of other types. And this is why we will always witness situations where migration coexists with unemployment. You can perfectly have migration and unemployment of nationals at one and the same time. This happens in Europe, but it happens in other regions as well. It happens in the Gulf. It happens in other regions of the world. Now, what may really result in change in migration rates, in migration volumes, are again the very same factors that generate migration. For instance, if you have in countries that receive Egyptian migrants, such as in the Gulf, if you have extended low prices of oil, if you have extended drops in oil revenues, this, of course, will result in reduced migration and even in return migration. And here, you may expect some pressure on European labor markets and on Europe as country of destination. Because, after all, if you take, this is proper to Egypt, if you take Egyptian migration, you'll have the same characteristics of Egyptian migration in the Gulf and in Europe. The same male migration, the same mid-level educated to highly educated migration. So you may have a transposition. If one labor market is closed, you may have movement towards another labor market, such as in Europe, or in the case of Egypt, in Jordan. I'm talking about lower oil prices. I will talk in a moment about another possibility, which is a worse possibility. In the case of Egypt, I think you can also, for the future, you may also observe, monitor the impact and the outcomes of terrorism, extremist cultural discourse, restraint, freedom of expression. This may result in some migration, especially of middle classes to higher middle class. In the case of Egypt, you also have to look at external political factors. Instability in the Gulf Cooperation Council, which hosts over 50% of Egyptian migration. Instability as a result of tensions with Iran may result in large return migration. This is why Egypt has no interest in increased tension in the region of the Gulf. Instability in Jordan also as a result, and here I'm talking about political factors, instability in Jordan as a result of ideas about settling the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian conflict, that is at the expense of Jordan, by envisaging return or by envisaging transferring of Palestinians to Jordan, may be extremely destabilizing and may also result in a large return of Egyptian migrants, who are around 700,000 in Jordan, to Egypt. This is extremely worrying in the case of Egypt. The political factors, again, are much more important than the economic factors are predictable. We know about how population and labor force will grow. We know how economies may grow, but the political factors are unpredictable. And as I said, because migration systems are communicating, you may witness a shift in migration movements from the Gulf and Jordan to Europe. In the case of Morocco, no serious internal factors of instability should be expected. Of course, we don't know what the situation in in Algeria how it may result, how it may turn out to be in a few months. And of course, if there is a situation of extended instability in Jordan, this may affect. In fact, any significant change, whether good or bad, in Algeria should have its impact on Morocco. Short of this, I think that it is difficult, it is hard to expect significant changes in Morocco. As for external factors, you can hardly expect significant changes in the labor markets of Moroccan migrants. In Europe, it is very difficult to expect a fundamental change in the coming years in their political systems. Of course, if these fundamental changes happen, this may have impact on migration. But situation as it has been witnessed in the last years, I do not think that we may expect negative consequences for Moroccan migration. And what applies to Morocco also applies to Tunisia. Tunisia, equilibrium in Tunisia is ensured by, or let's say, the absence of a possible deep instability in Tunisia is a consequence of the equilibrium of liberal forces, of political forces in Tunisia. There are cleavages in the secular camps. There are cleavages in the religious camp. However, despite these cleavages, the two camps are of comparable strength, with no one camp being able to dominate the others, and therefore Tunisia should not be expected to generate significant migration flows, and the external factors that we reviewed in Morocco are also valid for Tunisia, since their labor markets are the same. I think one country that deserves a few words is Libya. I mentioned Libya at the beginning as being a source of return migration to its two largest providers of migrant workers, Egypt and Tunisia. But situation in Libya should be monitored, because Libya at the moment is divided at least in two, if not more, because you have even some fragmented political forces dominating in the south of Libya. Libya, with a power vacuum, has, of course, given room, has opened its territory to all sorts of operations of criminal and non-criminal type. The operations that are all called smuggling operations are not necessarily so. Some operations have been existent over centuries. Crossing the Sahara Desert is something natural in the region. It's not, if you take you across roads in the desert, this someone has existed for centuries without being smuggled, being called a smuggler. So some of these people are only practicing are only practicing a function which is necessary in the desert. But some others are, of course, criminal gangs. And with the collapse of authority, these criminal gangs have increased their activities, and they have generated some migration flows.
10 minutes.
I'm about to finish even before 10 minutes. These, of course, have been faced up by the European Union. I mentioned the resolution of the Security Council that was adopted in October 2016, and many human rights groups are criticizing the policies of the European Union that push back some of these migrants towards the coast of Libya, where, because of the absence of state in Libya, are faced with the treatment that is imparted to them by some criminal groups, including within Libya itself. So this is a policy that may have proven useful in stopping migration movements, but not so useful in fact, when it comes to human rights and to the protection of migrants coming, by the way, from countries other than those of North Africa. So to say, I'm saying this to just also signify that migration movements are inscribed in larger systems of relations. Migration, the concept of system of migration is a concept that says that movements of migration only take place within a larger context of exchange between parties at origin and destination. The exchange is not only an exchange of human beings, it's an exchange of goods, exchange of services, an exchange of ideas, it's an exchange of cultural products. So if you affect negatively the movement of population, you are also affecting negatively the movement of your cultural ideas, of your values, of your goods, of your services. So the policies need to take this into account. Let me just go very quickly over some alternative scenarios that may unfold in the future. The first scenario is the consequence of the status quo in policies and in economic and political situations. Persistence of cooperation between North and South in the same forms and dimensions. Perpetuation of EU migration policies in the Mediterranean Sea. And extension of current political and economic situation. The result will certainly be the perpetuation of the current system, since we have not changed the determining factors. Migration from Morocco and Tunisia will remain small. From Egypt, migration will continue. This is in the best political situation cases, but they will go to the GCC and Jordans. And from other regions in Africa, migration will persist, but in limited volumes because of the success of policy facing up to them. The second alternative, of course, is a very optimistic alternative. Libya is reintegrated. The economy is revitalized. Libya is reconstructed. And here you have the two main beneficiaries will be Egypt and Tunisia, with, of course, if Europe is taken into account, with reduced flows from these two countries to Europe. But not only that, a reconstruction of Libya will also be very beneficial to Europe. In reality, it will be beneficial not only in terms of contracts for reconstruction and oil, but even migration movements from Europe to Libya, in addition, of course, to beneficiaries from West Africa and Central Africa. The third scenario is political tensions, those that I have referred to a few minutes ago, political tensions in major labor markets of Egypt, in the Gulf and in Jordan, because of the confrontation with Iran in one case, and because of the outcomes of the initiatives regarding the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And in the same scenario, the assumption is persistence of labor migration policies in the EU. And here you will have large return migration to Egypt and compounded labor market pressures. And we have seen, in fact, that recently return migration last year, large return migration to Egypt from Libya has compounded the economic situation, labor market situation, which may produce pressures on the EU and irregular migration in the case that labor migration policies in Europe remain constrained. The fourth and final scenario is a scenario even more optimistic, but which has to be taken into account if we look in the long term. Stabilized North African countries, efficient economies and reconstruction in Libya, continuing demand for labor in the GCC and Jordan, and low labor force growth in Morocco and Tunisia. Not Egypt. Egypt will continue with high labor force growth for some time. In this case, you will have migration from Egypt to Libya, to the GCC and Jordan, migration from Tunisia to Libya, possible increased migration from Morocco to Libya, and you will have reduced excess supply of labor in North African countries. So here, meeting demand for labor, that we have seen that in Europe there is demand for labor because of structural issues and because of the shortage in supplying labor for some occupation, for some sector, because of the reduced labor supply as a result of reduced fertility. All of this will be difficult to meet, because if you have growth, domestic growth, and you have growth in neighboring countries that are the traditional markets of the increased supply of labor in Egypt, then and reduced supply of labor in Morocco and Tunisia, you may find difficulty in meeting a demand for labor in other regions, especially in Europe. My final slide is about migration policies for the future. In the past, migration policies in the Euro-Mediterranean areas have been, and in fact, not only migration. In fact, in general, policies are always formulated by the strongest, and then the weakest are policy takers. And I'm not talking about migration alone. If you take economic policies, for instance, economic policy frameworks are formulated, are designed by the international financial institutions, and then they are made to be adopted by other countries, including, by the way, by Spain and by Greece. So imagine they are made to be adopted, but without the necessary resources by more developing countries. But when it comes to migration also, you will see that migration policies have always been in the Euro-Mediterranean area, have always been formulated at the European level, whether it is the global approach to migration and mobility, and before that you had so many initiatives. They are formulated at European level, and then they are adopted, or they are made to be adopted by countries on the other shore of the Mediterranean, with, of course, incentives in terms of resources, in terms of technical assistance provided either bilaterally or by some international organization. I think that the absence of satisfaction, because I'm not talking about failure or success, because I think there has been some success if you look at it from the very narrow perspective of migration alone. Who comes, who departs. But if you place migration policy in the larger context of policies between the two shores of the Mediterranean, and if you take into account the lack of satisfaction about how population movements take place between the two shores, I think this should make us think of a joint formulation of migration policies. Migration policies should be a matter of consultation, should be a matter of negotiations, And then each and every part will have to play its own role. But to formulate policies and expect the other party only to implement, this has not given the required results and will very difficultly give the required results. And these policies should not, again, be about who comes in and how many people come in or how many people depart. They should also address the employment question, should address the skills, address skill formation, skill retention, training, because migration takes place within some realities of the labor markets at the north and at the south. We cannot isolate migration from the larger economic situation, certainly not from the political situation, because, again, migration systems are much larger than labor market, are much larger than economic. They inscribe themselves in larger socio-economic systems. Very finally, I think we cannot expect migration policies to succeed. We cannot, and when we say migration policy, I think our concern should be with closer cooperation on the two sides of the Mediterranean because of ensuring security, but because also of the good of the two parts. In the south of the Mediterranean, there is a question of underdevelopment, of needed development that should push forward. But in Europe also, there is a need to look at the place of Europe in the world. Europe has been losing tremendously. Europe in 2020 weighs much less in the global economy than it weighed in 1980. And it will even weigh less and less as we go forward. China is Indonesia, India. These are really the powers that are growing, and they are constituting largest and largest shares of the global economy. So I think this should be it. But this will also require that you address the cultural biases, exclusionary discourses, and antagonisms. And on both sides. I'm not talking about this exists only in the north of the Mediterranean, they exist in the south of the Mediterranean also. Without the policy framework addressing the cultural issues that are being brought forward falsely, because after all, it's not culture that is behind migration movements, but without addressing them because they have been made to occupy such a place in the discourse, I think they need to be addressed and they need to be part of the joint formulation of migration policy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Awad, for this interesting conference and lecture. And this allows us also to have some discussion about the Euro-Mediterranean, or maybe Mediterranean with the Euro, Mediterranean migration space as a space also of reflection and for migration studies, which is one of the also objective of the master. I think we can learn maybe three main ideas. The first thing that we have learned is that we have to avoid Eurocentrism in general when we are speaking about migration, not only dynamics, but also in trying to explain the dynamics of migration in the mobility in Europe. Then I think it is also good to have some position from the south and to understand also, because you have noticed that Professor Awad is speaking about instability, political instability, but in a very broad in destination countries, not only in origin country. And then I think this kind of reflection is very healthy mentally also for us. That we always assume Eurocentrism lens and so on. I think the concept of instability is very interesting also, because one of the argument that has been put forward is that we have to think about, in Mediterranean terms, we have to think in terms of economic, but also in political instability. Maybe we need to learn more about what does instability means in general, because maybe there's some relation between instability and democratization. I don't know, but maybe from a European point of view, we understand instability or political instability in the south of Mediterranean in terms of democratization or not democratization. And then please tell me that I am wrong, and then maybe we need to have some more information about what that. But in any case, political instability matters. Not only economic instability. This is one we can learn also from the conference. And then I think it is also important to learn about that. And the third idea that I think could be interesting to discuss is about this kind of desideratum that is always there, but very difficult to implement. That solution cannot only come from one side, but it's always a joint work between south and north. This kind of joint policy that you mentioned are very important, and I think it could be also interesting to think pragmatically how to do that. This kind of joint policy between north and south and so on. Maybe there are other questions, but I don't want to take the floor for that. But maybe instability could affect differently to different generations. I was thinking about myself of political instability affect young generation differently from other generation, even in the south. And then maybe if we incorporate the idea of generation, we can learn also about migration, because we know that young people are much more willing to migrate than old people. This is one pattern that is completely different from maybe the last past years, that maybe the migrants were much more older. They are not parents, they are the young people that want to build families without families, that want to build families. And then this is the kind of, and then maybe instability, political instability affect much more this kind of generation than others that were much more economic oriented and not politically oriented. I don't know that, but maybe we can learn about that. But in any case, I don't want to take the floor, just some reflection, and the floor is for the students and for the public. We can take maybe 1 or 2 or 3 questions a first round, and maybe to do a second round until 8 o'clock. We have some time. The floor is yours. Okay. I think we have a micro because of.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm a master's student in the migration course. You said that in Egypt, the type of migrants that go to the Gulf countries and in Europe are quite the same. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. And connected to this question, is there any kind of brain drain in Egypt? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Okay, we take 2 questions more and then it's okay for you? Yes.
Well,
Any question also?
thank you, Professor Awad.
Maybe you present yourself because.
Okay,
Sorry for that.
I'm Cristina Sala. I'm working here at IEMed at the editorial team, and I was a student of Professor Awad back at AUC, so I'm glad to hear you again.
You close a circle.
I wanted to ask about one. Those people that leave Spain after the crisis, or those people working at international organizations in Egypt, are they considered migrants? Are they just expats? How are these concepts accepted in the southern shore of the Mediterranean?
Thank you. I think no, you are another one.
My name is Luis Recolons. I am occupied in a ONG named Migra Studium here in Barcelona. 2 questions focused mostly in Morocco and Spain. In Morocco, here we have experienced lately, last years, and this year, a high increase of MENAs, MENAS, minor non-accompanied. Yeah, and what that means, how do you explain, related the situation in Morocco that has that outcome? And because this is really extraordinary increase. The other point is related to Spain. Our pyramid of ages almost double people 40 years aged to 20 years aged. So the need of labor people So the need of more labor people, because here the community rate is very low, maybe push strongly, in my opinion, I would like to know your opinion, for increasing immigration here in the future. How do you think about it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Awad told me that if you want to formulate in Spanish, he speaks Spanish, he speaks French, he speaks many languages, much more than me. In any case, if you want to formulate in another language, this is what he was telling me. But in any case, this is your turn. You want to react to some questions and to reflections, and then we will do another turn, another round.
Well, thank you very much for all your questions. You know, Egyptian migration is a male migration. There was a higher female component, in fact, in the 1970s and 80s than there is now. It's a male migration. It's a young migration that has become higher skilled than it was in the 70s and 80s. And it's a temporary migration. Egyptian migrants, on average, migrate for 5-6 years, and then they return. And this applies to Egyptian migrants in the Gulf, as it applies to migrants to to Italy or Greece, which are the largest European labor markets for Egyptian migrants. It also applies to Egyptians in France, for instance. This is what I meant by similarity of migration patterns from Egypt. Brain drain from Egypt. You know, Egypt suffers from very high rates of unemployment of youth, and the educated youth to highly educated youth. The highest unemployment rate is for the medium-level educated, and then it goes down a little for the university graduates. But it's very high in both cases. And in women, of course, it's higher even. However, now let me put it this way. So, migration from Egypt of the highly educated, will it be really a loss to the labor market in Egypt? This is the issue. Second, it's still a very low rate of highly skilled migration from Egypt because of the large pool of university graduates in Egypt. So you have, in fact, lower than 3% of university graduates from Egypt migrate. And therefore, it is difficult to talk about brain drain in the case of Egypt. Even if, of course, migration is selective, and therefore you will have more migration from certain occupations, and this may have a negative effect on them. But in general, you cannot talk of brain drain so far in Egypt. Again, recognizing that the highly skilled and highly educated are extremely important for development, and this should not be neglected. But if you compare to Morocco or to Tunisia, yes, Morocco and Tunisia have a high. You have like between 15 and 17% rates of highly educated migrants. mean 15 to 17% of all those university graduates are abroad. You have all classes of telecommunication engineering, for instance, who migrate. Lebanon is even more dramatic. Lebanon and women in Lebanon it reaches 40%. Christina, I'm very glad to see you again. Yes, people, human beings, we like to generalize. But we forget that in statistics of international migration, you have like 6 to 7% of them are from north to south. And there has always been migration from north to south, by the way. People, I don't know if this volume has already been published or not, but the American University in Cairo Papers in Social Science will soon have a volume that I have edited in which there are 2 articles about Italian and Greek migration to Egypt. And if you read how Italian migration went to Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century, you think you're reading about Egyptian migration to Italy now. It's exactly irregular migration, people coming to Egypt without contracts, without labor contracts. So you always had north to south migration. You always had north to south migration related to colonialism in the case of France and Morocco, France and Italy. So you've always had this. Now, you brought up something interesting, of course, terminology. Terminology is very important. A medical doctor is never a migrant worker. He's an expat. Someone working for Ritz-Carlton in Cairo will never be a migrant. He's an expat. So it's better. It sounds better for those who are high skilled. Yes. So you will have a distinction in policies and in the discourse related to migrants according to skill and according to whether they are low or highly skilled. Because in reality, countries of destination do not have any problem receiving the highly skilled. In fact, they attract them. In fact, they create the blue cards, for instance, to attract them. But not the low skilled, because the low skilled, there's so many of them in the Philippines and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So you can pick and choose at the moment you want without having policies. And at times even better without policies. Yeah, because this will reduce labor cost. So yes, there is. In fact, when you talk about migrant workers in general, we should distinguish between those called expats and those called migrant workers, highly skilled and low skilled. I think this will make for a better analysis. Increase of minors, migration of minors from Morocco. A
hot issue in this moment.
Yeah, no, I understand. The general figures tell another story, but of course it depends. I think we'll have to look at whether minors from Morocco have also increased in Italy, in France, in the Netherlands, or is it in Spain only? Because I think these are like communicating ways. So, for instance, you had increase in irregular migration to Spain recently when other routes were closed. So I think you will have to look at the whole picture, not only at Spain. But of course, from a general perspective as well, in Morocco, you still until now have poor labor market outcomes, despite all the projects that they have in north of Morocco. But again, in order to have a real picture of what happens and what generates migration flows, I think you have to look at the whole picture and not only about Spain. Demand for labor is a factor for migration, certainly, of course. demand for labor, if I understood well your question, whether this demand for labor in Spain or other countries of Europe will continue attracting migrants, yes, certainly. The question, I think, that in the long term, this should be taken into account, because in the long term, there might not be sufficient workers to meet demand in Morocco and in Spain and Italy. I think this is something that, population policies have to be long term. Population policies do not produce outcomes the next day. They produce outcomes after decades. So this will have to take into account. And at times, one is surprised at the discourse, at the hostility of the discourse. What will happen the day that this will have to change? How can you change the discourse from one day to the other? No, your question, instability and democratization. I think this is a very, very interesting question. The young are more inclined to migrate. Of course, there is a larger movement. If you look at the statistics of international migration, you have migrant workers or migration, and you have refugees, and you have students. You have students, the rate of or let's say the percentage of students in that is increasing. So yes, the youth is moving, and I guess one evidence is here probably, and in our classes. But I think interesting question about instability and democratization. Frankly,
But just to provoke you.
No. It's a very good. It's a very interesting question because I agree with you that democracy, participation, representation, and real effective participation will make for stability. The question is that even in established democratic countries, democracy now is at question. This is the real question here. And this is taken as an excuse in countries that are not democratic for not democratizing. Yeah?
Look at Europe.
This is exactly what I mean. Look at the movement, the anti-democratic movements within democratic countries, and look at the totally illiberal sort of systems in Central Europe. This, of course, create instability as well, because they create it because they inject large doses of egocentric interests. And egocentric interests are inimical to international cooperation. If you concentrate and you focus on yourself, you do not cooperate with the country next door. And we've had experiences with this in the last 2 centuries, and we know how egocentrism in international relations and leads to tragedies and leads to universal disasters. And if universal disaster happens, it will be quite something.
Thank you. I don't know if we have another time. I look for Elizabeth because I know that you have to close the door at 8, but we can have another round. Okay, thank you for your openness. Okay, it's your turn.
Hello,
Very
my
brief
name.
because we are out of time.
Okay, my name is Yannis, and I'm also a student in the Masters of Migration Studies at Zapata. And I have a question regarding one of the readings which were assigned for today.
I'm not sure that the macro function.
No, I can hear.
And you can listen. Okay.
Okay, I will try to speak up if it's not possible to hear. And it said that migration, which is to the Gulf countries and to Europe from Egypt, is characterized rather as temporary migration, as you just said. And migration to North America, on the other hand, and Oceania is characterized as permanent migration, or tends to be permanent. Is this due to the difficult labor market entry conditions, or due to the employment which is sought for in these countries, or the different workers which tend to migrate to these countries, or yeah?
Thank you.
I think I'm finished.
Understood?
Yes, yes.
Another question? We can take another one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. My name is Nicolas Vlies. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sussex and currently based at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, here in Barcelona. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think I could take with quite a lot. And my question touches up on a little bit on what the gentleman before said and some points you raised in your presentation. And I was wondering what role border management plays in predicting or also understanding migration movements within the region. I think from a European perspective, border management, internal and external, plays quite a big role in the literature and also in the media. But I would be curious to hear a little bit more about how states kind of regulate, control borders within the region in North Africa or do they care about it at all?
Okay, thank you. I think it's okay. Maybe we can
Yes,
take these
yes.
two and then
Yes.
we close the door.
Well, thank you very much for the two questions. And temporary and permanent migration. Frankly, I'm not very favorable to this categorization of permanent and temporary any longer because, people change very quickly. If you take a Lebanese migrant will go to Canada when economic situation in Lebanon is deficient. As soon as it improves, they come back from Canada and they work in Lebanon. It deteriorates again, they move out again. So, in fact, these two categories are no longer really valid as they used to be. This having been said, the difference between migration to Europe and the Gulf and to North America and Oceania is due to two different systems of migration. North America and Oceania are the traditional migration, the old migration countries, traditional migration countries, where you migrate not because of labor markets demand. You migrate, and once you set foot there, you have started your path towards naturalization and towards becoming a permanent or a citizen of these countries. Whereas this is not the case in countries that have not considered, in Europe until recently, European countries did not consider themselves as immigration countries. It's only recently they have considered themselves as immigration countries. So I think that it depends on how countries define themselves. In the old times, of course, in the late 1960s, the United States changed its migration policy and attracted migrants from developing countries, which was not the case before. And this is when Egyptians started to migrate to the US. And they migrate similarly to Australia and migrate similarly to Canada, even because of the distance. They left, and in fact, no one saw them again. It's only recently with what you say about communication and transportation that they have started coming back. Whereas Europe is different. First, migrating to Egypt, from Egypt to Europe was very, very limited until recently. But there is proximity. And systems, you do not have systems of permanent, of settlement migration in the Europe as you have them in Canada and the United States. So I think this should be explained by policy of countries of destination, not by the Egyptian migrants himself or herself. Border management. I think border management is what we may consider as very narrow perspective on migration. It is migration in its narrowest sense when you focus on border management. Because, frankly, I do not think that many students will have been interested in migration studies if it were only about border management. In fact, migration studies are interesting because they are not border management. They are much larger than border management. But border management, of course, is one policy measure. And in the case of Europe in particular, when it comes to countries of the southern border management has been externalized. Externalized, of course, you are familiar with all of this. The readmission agreements are part of externalizing the borders. The famous Regulation 51, 2001, for instance, where even airlines have become part of border management. Before you board an airline, you have to show your before check-in, you have to board. So yes, border management is part of. However, border management, all it can do is create irregular migration, rather than migration in regular conditions creates irregular migration. And if you manage borders through patrolling some parts of the Mediterranean, for instance, in addition to other measures, you will only have an increase in other parts of the Mediterranean. Yeah. So Spain, the Spain front was quiet for quite a few years. Recently, it has increased again because of the success of patrolling in the central Mediterranean. So, yes, border management is given importance and is part of securitization. Yeah? It is security forces that enforce. But I think securitization has failed those who securitize and have failed those who are securitized. And I think the best way is to broaden the perspective for formulating policies. And again, I think for jointly formulating policies.
Okay, thank you very much for your last words. And I think we bring with us so many arguments around Mediterranean migration. As you know, you will have other opportunity with other professors from this recently created network of IEMed that will come. And we have also the opportunity to follow up this reflection on Mediterranean migration. Thank you very much, Professor Awad, to be with us and to open this reflection.
Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Gracias a ti.